Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Refold podcast. My name is Clayton, also known as George Pig, and I manage the community here at Refold. Today, I have a very special episode with McKAY. He is a high level Tagalog learner and a former missionary who served in the Philippines. So, join us today as we talk all about learning Tagalog, Filipino, the Philippines, and what it's like to be trained to speak a language from the Mormon Missionary Training Center in just 6 weeks. All right, and McKAY, welcome. Thank you for being on today.
Yeah, no
Uh,
problem.
do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself? So, who are you, and what is your relationship with languages and the language learning community?
Oh, so I'm McKay. I'm from a small town in Utah. I got interested in languages really young. I had a friend who moved here from India, and he just fascinated me when he would babble with his family. And I believe he mostly spoke in Hindu. Could have been another dialect, but after that, I started just kind of dabbling in languages for a while. I really didn't get um, into languages till I was like serious until I was about an adult. That's when I really started learning languages, and it was I think I got serious with my first language would be when I was 18, about 19, essentially. And it's when I was assigned to speak Tagalog, and I just started studying right away as soon as uh, I got called to serve in the Philippines. So I was like, well, better learn Tagalog, and I
And
haven't stopped.
and when you say you got called to serve or assigned to learn Tagalog, that's because you are a member of the what used to be called the Mormon Church.
Well, it's always been the nickname, and it's still going to be our nickname for a long time. The official name is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter Day Saints. Kind of
Okay,
long, so
LDS, I guess.
yeah, LDS. So it's understandable. We're still called Mormon, the Book of Mormon, and whatnot. So, yeah, yeah, so LDS Mormon, I'm a member of that church, and I wanted to serve a mission, and I did put in the application that I would be very interested in learning a language. And I even said, if I go from Utah to Colorado, I'll be fine as long as I get another language. But I was quite thrilled to get assigned to the Philippines, Northern Philippines, and Tagalog's been love at first sight. It's been a language that's been just a part of my life every day since. I haven't let it go. But
Now, you were assigned to the Northern Philippines,
mhm.
um, and it's interesting that you were assigned to Tagalog and not another language. Depending on how far north we're talking.
Well, it's so I started in Ifugao, and
Okay,
so my first area would consist of Banawi, the rice terraces.
okay.
And, so just like as a reference for people who haven't been to the Philippines, at the end of, Avengers: The Infinity War, Thanos teleports to before they did the CGI planet for number 2, he, uh, he's in the Philippines. They shot that in the Philippines in the Banawi rice terraces, a small village called Batad, and, I lived around that area. Um,
Interesting.
Very
And
beautiful.
the rice terraces, they're famous because they needed to be able to grow rice on mountains because Ifugao is part of that, I guess, Cordillera. I'm
Mm,
not really sure how you pronounce it.
I
Mountain
think you got
range.
it. Yeah, yeah. Uh,
Yeah, and the Ifugao people, there's actually an ethnic group. They're like sort of one of the they're Austronesian like the rest of the majority of Filipinos, but they
mhm.
were not a super Hispanicized group. You can sort of divide Filipinos into Hispanicized lowlanders and then more traditional highlanders, people in the mountains. Um,
Right, right. That's true. As and I as I got acquainted with when I first got there, I'd only been studying Tagalog for 6 weeks, but immediately I was struggling because I'd hear people talk and I'd write down the words that they were saying. And I had a companion at the time who was from Texas, and he'd studied Tagalog at that point 6 months. And he was elbowing me as he'd look at my notepad. He said, uh, Thane, my last name, that's Ifugao. That's not Tagalog. And I go, oh shoot, you know, because there are so many languages in the Philippines, and Tagalog's one of the assigned languages just because it's a useful kind of second language for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Like Ifugao, it would have been better if I spoke Ifugao, but since I wasn't there the full time, we move around quite a bit. It was just like Tagalog it is. Some people gave up and spoke Ilocano, but that's pretty few people. But yeah, so many
Yeah.
languages, we just had to pick a middle ground.
Yeah, I
I'm
think the number is officially 185, but I think 5 of that 185 might actually now be, like, moribund or extinct. Um,
oh
so
yeah,
there's quite a few languages. It's, not like a lot of countries that people are familiar with, because people tend to be familiar with the big sort of historically united nationalized countries like France and the USA and Japan, where they're
right,
very linguistically uniform.
right,
The
exactly,
Philippines is not. It's very diverse.
very much so. And there's the language is quite political over there. Some people don't like the idea of a national language. Some people see it as kind of a obstacle since it's not intellectualized in a way that like Japanese, French, or English is. So sometimes they just start having their kids speak English as soon as they can,
Mm.
or sometimes Spanish,
Yeah,
rarely, something like that.
that's a problem. There's a lot of it's Filipino languages are low prestige. But,
Yeah,
they're not very high prestige languages even in the Philippines.
right.
Um, but you mentioned, being assigned to Tagalog, and tell me about that experience because out of all of the foreigners I've met, um, people who are members of the LDS Church tend to be quite competent. Now, over the past 7 years, I realized that the people who blew me away 7 years ago were not as good as I thought, but they were still very decent, especially compared to your average, person who is involved in the Philippines. So, like, there's a lot of, Western expats, there's a lot of Korean expats, um, and by and large, the largest group of sort of foreigners I've met who speak a Philippine language, who are not Filipino, tend to be Mormons.
It's yeah, language learning is a big part of the religion technically because it's there's a big emphasis on missionary work and the whatnot. So a lot of us are assigned to learn another language, and when we are assigned to learn another language, essentially you are sunk in it. It's like Refold immersion, but forced a little bit. You can't escape it. There's no taking a break, really. Um, so when I arrived in Ifugao, I essentially, well, and even in the when I arrived at the Missionary Training Center, which was June 19th, 2013, I never went a day without speaking Tagalog, probably since then. Like it's sink or swim because while I was in Ifugao and the other areas, there's a lot of people who just don't speak English or speak a language um, and so you have no choice but to really get involved with the language, and even in a just in an immersive way, just seeing how the people live, their culture. Sometimes you're learning and not realizing it. So it's very helpful in that regard to uh, be just submerged in it. And So it's very I wonder if I could have how long it would have taken me to learn Tagalog otherwise. Just like, because before, I didn't know about Refold till, probably about
Yeah,
2015.
2013. I mean,
Yeah, or not even 15. No, I was exposed to Refold clear after. It was, I'd learned about AJAT because I went to the same school as Katsumoto, and, I never met him, but,
okay.
years apart, but I just had read about him, and I was like, "Oh, I'm in the same situation at the same school," and so I got into AJAT and, or learned about AJAT, and then you kind of leads you to Matt versus Japan, and that kind of leads you to Refold a little bit. And so, yeah, it's Refold has those principles essentially, in a way, slightly more on input since we're missionaries. We have to be talking,
Mhm.
than more on input than Refold that is. But yeah, yeah, it's
And what exactly do you guys do at the MTU, the Missionary Training what is it?
center.
Center, MTC?
Mhm. MTC,
Not
yeah,
M
that's right.
MTC, not MTU, okay. We were
Yeah.
talking about,
Oh, I
Thanos earlier.
mentioned UVU, the Utah Valley University, which is where, Cat
Ah, okay.
well, yeah,
Gotcha.
yeah, so he was right down the road from the MTC, but, um, the MTC is very, you spend a lot of time studying, uh, is in a nutshell. When you first get there, they gave you a packet of books depending on your language, as, as people know, some languages have more resources than others. Tagalog, I got 2 textbooks from the University of Hawaii, uh, 3 or so
Who
little
wrote
lit
those books?
I think you might
I've m
know her,
Teresa something?
yeah, yeah, I had her name written down somewhere. It's, Professor, yeah, it's Professor Teras,
Teresa.
uh
She's very famous, though. She's
yeah,
yeah,
she's done the bulk of a lot of Filipino work, so,
mhm. I
she's
think she also has, like, a graded reader from, like, the '80s out there. Um, I think it's like a Tagalog newspaper reader from the '80s, and I'll
yeah,
be honest, I don't like to read the news in Tagalog in 2023, so I cannot imagine reading, Tagalog because, Tagalog news, as as you know, chooses the weirdest vocab, you know?
yeah,
I
there's
I I don't understand, like, I have never heard a person again, I've never heard a person use the word lalawigan in speech.
oh, yeah.
Everybody just says probinsya, right? But then you read the news and it's like, "No, we can't use English words. No, we can't use Spanish words. We have to use the most obscure." That's how it feels. I'm sure it's not, but,
Yeah,
uh,
yeah, I know the feeling because and I remembered her name, it's Ramos, Teresita V. Ramos.
Teresita B. Ramos. Okay.
Yeah, and her works are still you can find them on Amazon. Um, so you
No,
were
they're quite
given
good for textbooks.
yeah, I like the 2 we were given. There's a 3rd one, I actually didn't recommend on the Refold channel. I said I wouldn't. It's poorly titled Modern Tagalog, and it is the most archaic Tagalog. I mean, there's some I hate to say it like that, but there's just some chapters that will just not be useful unless you're really into, like, some formal speech. There's some chapters that are great. Like you were saying, there's this register of Tagalog that's just, um, not really used except in formal situations. And one of the negative experiences of the MTC was, in addition with these books, we're given, Latter-day Saint scriptures in Tagalog, which is very formal. And then
I
we were
remarked on that to you, I think, pretty
we
recently. I said the Catholic and the Protestants sort of have a Taglish version of the Bible, um,
right.
and it's sort of updated, for 2023.
Mhm.
Um, Whereas I actually I'm not religious, but I do have like Sephardia, which is like a Jewish book app with all sorts of Jewish literature, like
Mhm. Right.
like Rashi and stuff, and um, I have the Mormon app that has the Book of Mormon and associated literature
For
um,
sure. Mm.
in in a whole bunch of different languages, just out of curiosity, and it's written in that sort of formal register,
Yeah.
and
Mhm.
I find it almost a little bit unpleasant to read. Um, it just never comes off well to me, and it's different from native Tagalog. Somebody who's from deep
Mm.
province speaking Tagalog still doesn't speak that way.
Right.
Um, it's just a very sort of artificial sounding form of the language to me. Um,
Yeah. So a lot of people feel that way, and it gets even worse with the Bible, too, because the Bible has conjugations, for plurality that
like Magsi.
I like. Well, not just Mugsi. Like my mother-in-law sometimes still uses Mugsi, but like mangag at uh papag pagga, it's the NGA just mashed in there. So manga, which is MA but pluralized, for
Okay.
and there's a huge list of them, and if you learn that list, you'll only be able to read the Bible. That is the only book. I think like the Quran, I don't find too much of that in there. The Book of Mormon, not the plural. It's very formal to God, but not the plural conjugation. So my point being that there's a lot of depth in Tagalog that, and funny enough, I'm actually the opposite. I loved the depth of it, but it wasn't a good way to start. That was the problem. They were teaching you very formal Tagalog in the beginning, and you would go out and, like you said, people just wouldn't click with that. Um, so Spanish speakers might relate with like para, um, but at the MTC they were teaching us upang, and in
I
order to
only hear that in songs.
right,
Um,
right. It very, very classical Tagalog, and weirdly
and
enough,
it
like I
sounds great at times. One thing that irritates me as a fellow person who has Tagalog in his life. I wouldn't call myself a learner anymore because I might read a book in it now and then and use it, but I don't like sit down and study it. I'm not making Anki cards.
right.
Um, One of the things that frustrates me is people are like, oh, there's so much Spanish, and I'm like, actually, one of the hard parts of Tagalog is you have to learn both. Like
Mhm.
somebody might one day just use the native word even if it's not super common. There are some speakers you just never know. Um, you can be sure that the English will probably be understood. The Spanish might be understood, and the deeper form might not be understood. But then speakers may randomly, like we had this discussion recently on the server where, like, in some places they prefer the Spanish word for necktie, right?
Mhm.
And then other places they prefer the English word for necktie, and it's like village to village, it might just differ. So you end up having to know 3 or 4 words for the exact same thing, is what it feels like to me.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, and, it is, it's, like, got all these levels, and sometimes you may have to learn 3 words in 3 different languages, and they may feel that they all cover the same ground, like opportunity, oportunidad, pagkakataon, it's a lot of times they mean all the same things, um, in certain scenarios, but and I noticed this especially when I moved to Manila, and it's very heavy on the Taglish, and, so it was weird because I spoke Tagalog, I spoke English, but I couldn't quite speak Taglish because sometimes I was using English in the wrong way, or I just some words would click. I'd mentioned on the chat that you'd say a word, and an older person would just snap. That was like nothing to them. But a younger person would just be more associated, more at home with the English, like when
It's the weirdest thing too because they'll
yeah,
tell you, "No one uses that word," and I'm like, "I just heard it." So my example,
yeah,
was the word barrio
barrio.
for for your barangay, and, um, someone I got home and somebody I was talking to, like a Gen Z person, upper middle class med student, and I was talking about the barrio, and she was like, don't say that word. No one says that word." I'm like, "I just heard it 30 minutes ago, like, literally while I was at the Turo Turo getting food." Um, and I'm always surprised at what people don't know because I do have a base in Spanish, so I don't bat an eye at a Spanish word. Like, if somebody said ventilador for an electric fan, okay, that's just a Spanish word, or, um, even the word marca for, like, brand. Right? Like, to
Mhm.
me, that sounds fine, and I've heard old people like Marcan Caballo, like horse brand, they're referring to Red Horse beer, and like Marcan Demonio, it's
Oh, yeah.
GSM, right? Sounds fine to me, but then I've used that word with Filipinos, and I've had younger Filipinos look at me like, "What's a marca? What?" And I'm like, "It's a brand?" And,
Yeah.
it's always a sort of a balancing act as to what register and what sort of vocab. Um, and And I guess being up north, we haven't really gotten into the MTU, but that's okay. We can come back to it. I guess being up north, one thing I have noticed with Filipinos, only 30% of Filipinos are native Tagalog speakers. So for
Right.
most people, it's an L2,
Yeah, right. Mhm.
and different L2 speakers have different ways of speaking Tagalog, and it's
Yeah.
not the way that you learn in books.
It
Um,
oh, yeah.
so you know, I've mostly interacted with Visayans, not a whole lot of northern people like Ifugao or Ilocanos, but like they don't really get conjugations. Um, they don't really get bo as a politeness particle.
Right.
Uh,
Mhm.
and some Bicolanos have it. They have tabi. Tagalog obviously has po and ho, and I think Kapampangan has pu. So like there are a couple of different languages once you get into like southern Luzon where they all have this politeness particle, and then at least down south they don't have it. So you get the situation where people who are used to that politeness particle think that these people are rude, and it's like they just don't have it in their language, and they're not good at using it.
And
Um,
oh, yeah, and that hierarchy of politeness alters with, um, almost like you were saying from village to village, because from the textbooks we are given, there's a chapter that I'll call it Professor Ramos. She writes about uh, you need to say you singular for friends, plural, just like in Latin languages. For more polite strangers, whatnot, which was kind of familiar. I'd studied some Spanish, so I was, although I didn't speak Spanish, I was used to some of the ideas. And then there's ultra polite, which is you call them sila, which is they.
yeah,
And I would hear when I was first assigned in Ifugao, I imagine that I heard older people use they to refer to me, and I was super
mhm.
confused.
Yeah, if you
And
knock at the door, they
yeah,
say, "Sino ho sila?" And,
yeah,
yeah.
or even in a store, "Anong kailangan nila?" Like, "What's their need?" And I'm like, "I don't know them," and I'm looking around like I don't know who they are. And, but then I would go into a rural, barangay, a rural town, and I would say something like, "Kamusta po kayo? How are you doing?" And they would say, "No, I'm one person. You refer to me by a single pronoun." And it would be so frustrating because I'd be like, "No, I know the grammar," you know? Actually, since you're a stranger, it'd be like ustedes in Spanish, it would be, but, they had never heard
Yeah,
it.
yeah, unfortunately, not all Filipinos, have great Filipino or Tagalog, right? It's
Yeah, it really
I
did.
don't think Tagalog ever totally shook its origins off as being like the language of the Tagalogs, which are an ethnic group.
Right.
So you've got a lot of people who view it as sort of like imperialist, imperial Manila type
Mhm.
stuff, and
Yeah.
there's some ethnic issues as well. Like different ethnic groups don't always get along, and various
Mhm.
things in history. Um, but it
Kind of
is the
a
national
rivalry,
language.
like North and South, I notice, there feels like it's like, it's almost like it's light, so it's almost like North and South are different sports teams, and they don't like each other, but if they got together, they enjoy, a drink together. Filipinos are super playful people. When it comes to, like, something like language policy, I noticed a lot of, like, Southerners don't like Tagalog, and they make it a point not to speak it, even if that's all you can speak sometimes, and
Yeah,
it's so
so the
pressure.
South is more solidly um, Cebuano or
Right.
Bisaya, whereas the North is divided up into a couple more regional lingua francas. So the South is very solid, 30 million speakers of L1 speakers of Cebuano. They can get by their whole life and never have to speak it.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
yeah, so I definitely understand. It's something that people learning a language like Japanese, where most speakers are native, they're not going to really grasp that you're talking to a Filipino. It doesn't mean you're talking to a native Tagalog speaker.
Right.
Um, and I'm always blown away by native Tagalog speakers, especially ones who are educated and do enjoy the language. Uh, I knew a guy who uh, his family was from, I think Mindoro, and even when he spoke like standard Tagalog, he wasn't dialectal. He would just talk circles around me, you know, and that's not something that I experienced talking to like somebody who's Bisaya. I'm like, okay, we're at the same level here, like we're conversational and stuff, but like clearly it's not your L1, it's not my L1. So when talking to the very rare, because I don't meet too many native Tagalog speakers, I always feel like outmatched. It's very bizarre. It's a strange feeling.
It
Um,
is, and I like your example with, brand and marca because, that's probably a really good example because, like, there will be a lot of people, a lot of young people who prefer brand, and then you'll hear marca, and then you'll, like, run into some, like, Filipino professor, and he'll be like, "Oh, actually, we use tatak for that on official stuff," and you're like, "I have never heard that," but the Tagalogs, especially I've noticed there's, a lot of people in, like, the Bulacan region, um, who have such a depth because they're one of the few, like, monolingual. There's quite a few monolingual people there, and it's monolingual in the national language, so there's a lot more resources and stuff, and literature and whatnot. And so there's sort of a depth there that's you don't find elsewhere, right? Um, there's a woman here in this small town where I'm at. I'm currently at a town with only 900 people, and there's a Tagalog speaker here that knows more than my dictionary. I mean, and it's just it's like you said, that's just something that wouldn't happen in Japan. I can't see from my short time in Japan, but uh yeah, there's that standardization isn't there, so it's kind of the linguistic Wild West a little bit because you could go from an hour by car and run into a village with a completely new language, and, there's just always something to learn, because even if, like, maybe Tagalog speakers are the best, like, native ethnically Tagalog speakers are the best, there's sort of, always a new language to learn in a way, because if you go with Ilocanos, for example, they might mix in Ilocano words in their Tagalog that you
mhm,
may need to communicate with them, and they may not just
yeah.
know a few extra Tagalog words that you may not have run into in the last, village. So there's always this, there's this, I think in all languages, you kind of always need this bit of humility as you're always kind of the visitor and you always need to be learning and trying to figure out, what's the best way I can communicate with these people or express myself in with what I want
I
to say.
I've noticed this. A lot of Filipinos will use their native language discourse particles in Tagalog. Um, so obviously, there's the native Tagalog ones like lang and ba and man and stuff. Um,
Mhm.
but there are some that I don't really recognize, and I'll talk to somebody from, say, like the Angeles area or something, and they will have, like, sort of Kapampangan s in their speech. And it's not just words, it's also grammar. The discourse particles and, um, people may not always know what a Tagalog word is and what isn't, um,
Right.
because it's sort of like speaking English in India where, like, most people speak it, but it's not their L1. But the
Mhm.
difference is that they're related languages, right? They're all from the same branch of Austronesian. So they may not fully understand, like a common one is like, you talk to a Visayan kid and he says, "Oh, langgam," and he means bird,
Right.
uh,
That's like,
uh, because in Bisaya langgam is, obviously it's bird, not ant.
right.
Um, and they just little weird mistakes like that. I remember being in the Eastern Visayas and I was talking with some people, and he was like, "Oh, I'm gonna go give this to my magulang," and I'm like, "Your parents are dead." I'm confused the whole time. And in his language, maguwang with a W means
Um,
older sibling.
all right, right. I forgot that. That's right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I was like totally confused because I've got this guy like, "Oh yeah, I'm gonna go give my parents this." He used the word for parent, which was cognate with the word for elder sibling in his language, but I didn't know that at the time. So I was just like, "Are we communicating here? What's going on?" Because definitely your parents are not alive. This is something that I know about you. Um, I know your background here, and
Right.
he was talking about his elder sibling, and that sort of stuff happens a lot with Filipinos. I think.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I as much as it's such a weird situation because like Tagalog isn't per se any or as many people's L1, but it is a big lingua franca for a lot of people. Even um, like I have a Tongan friend who speaks to me in Tagalog because he doesn't feel comfortable with English and stuff. And me and this oh oops, I'm getting scenarios mixed up, but I thought he was with me at this one time, but no, we were in a room full of Filipinos and Americans who could all at least speak Tagalog to some level. And there was a young Filipino or a Cebuana girl whose Tagalog wasn't quite there at that level, but that was the only language she could use to communicate with everybody else. But she ended up using a word, libog, to say she was confused about the card game she was playing, and
Right.
everybody in the room was like, yeah, I think she's aroused. Like, like in Cebuano, it means confused, but Tagalog
Mhm.
means aroused. And so it's weird. So it's got this position of being like the lingua franca because it is the best language still in the Philippines to get around with, but it's not standardized and taught in such an immense way as English or French or German. So
And
people still might be lacking in it.
yeah, and people tend to not read. I've met a lot of Filipinos who just don't read Filipino literature. Um, it's competing with English. The literate people are like, why would I read this when I could get, the fast food English content? Um,
Absolutely. Well, and that was what I was gonna say actually, going back to the MTC, that was weird because at first it wasn't a benefit learning really formal Tagalog, but as I got later in life and I enjoy reading books and from the Philippines, that all that formal Tagalog came in handy. Um, uh, it was my wife and I were watching Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers in Tagalog, and they mentioned, Gollum is leading Frodo and Sam into the bog, and they say the word they used was latian, and my wife's like, I have no idea what a latian, and I was like, oh, I know what that is. And like, the formal Tagalog isn't standardly mastered in the Philippines, and so um the good and bad thing about like the missionary training center is they teach you this really formal Tagalog, and so I found myself in situations where I would be in these small villages and I couldn't communicate natively. But then at like something like church or a funeral or something, somebody would read something and they would turn to me and be like, "Hey, what's this mean?"
Mm.
And that was the strangest feeling because, like, I went from being an idiot in conversation to the expert in literature, like in a matter of seconds because and I think the takeaway from that for people who are maybe like hearing this and they're not maybe learning Tagalog is there's a lot of languages in the world that aren't well, they're not standardized. I keep using that word. It might not be the right one.
Yeah,
Eh,
there's definitely a standard Tagalog. I think it's like
well, yeah, and
they're not used in all domains, right? So if you're in the
right,
Philippines, a lot of people are speaking something other than Tagalog at home.
right.
And then if they work in a bank or an office or something, they might be using English. So like where you can use English or Spanish or Japanese at all levels,
Right,
Filipino tends to be limited to certain domains. And
right, and I guess what I meant to say is, in every language, there's a gap between spoken and literature, but in
it feels
generally
monumental in Tagalog.
it feels monumental because of that usage, that domain. If you never run into the
It took
word.
me 2 years of learning Tagalog, and this is again before Refold, before I read my first book,
Mm,
because I knew a very conversational Tagalog, um, and I definitely leaned on Spanish vocab and stuff to give me the edge. Um, but I remember when I read my first book in Spanish, it was only after like 6 months of study
right,
because the overlap between spoken Spanish and written Spanish is not that big. Whereas
right.
you read written Tagalog, especially like fancy books, you get these archaic conjugations that are not
Mhm.
used.
Right,
Um,
right, and I've spoken with people who experience the same thing in those languages that are just aren't used in, every domain, like, and and if your language isn't like used as like the medium of instruction at a school or it's only used within a certain community, there's so many words that get lost in conversation or just not used anymore, but they're still written down somewhere, but then kind of forgotten. And so it's this weird gap. And the refold experience has really taught me about the importance of exposure because you take that word latian, the swamp, and it was because I learned it because I was exposed to it in some kind of book or something.
mm,
But then if you watch a film like Shrek in Tagalog, they just use the English for swamp because latian sounds too hard, too archaic.
mm.
And so it's kind of weird because I feel like they're making it easier, but then they're actually making it harder in the long run.
That
Because I
I
meant, yeah,
100% agree with that. It's easier because you can jump in with Taglish, but then it's
mhm,
harder because if you do want to learn that vocab, you don't get as many repetitions. Um,
yeah,
it's like I'm a big fan of the word alingaungaw,
oh yeah,
and everyone I hear in speech just uses echo.
Right. Mhm.
Um, and you know, Tagalog is a little bit weird grammar wise. Like I definitely think that even if there were no Taglish, um, it would still be a time consuming language to learn. Um,
Mhm.
but the lack of repetition makes getting that deep vocab hard. Um,
Right.
you have to almost seek it out, and then you kind of feel. I almost feel a little bit bitter sometimes when I learn a deep word that I don't know because I'm like, I will never see this word again, or if I do see it, it'll be in a fantasy story on Wattpad or something. Like it's not going to be a word that I hear watching Raffi Tulfo or something like that. And it's a little bit it's bittersweet because you're
Yeah.
like, yeah, I know this word now, but on the other hand, you're like, it's a word that I can never use, which feels a little bit bad.
Well, and it's weird having kids because that in that regard I kind of torture them in that way. I shouldn't say it like that, but as I'm raising my kids to speak Tagalog, my wife and I speak only Filipino at home, and we have to deal with that kind of issues. What do we have this mentality where we only teach our kids the known words, or do we only teach them the words that are um, we find in literature and in conversation, or do we even go deeper? Like I know the word for Tagalog in the word for bittersweet in Tagalog is agre dulce, which comes from Spanish,
Mhm.
and but that's a pretty intense word for a lot of people. But then if I if I'm only speaking Filipino to my children, do I speak the tag the Taglish one, bittersweet? But they're here in America, so they're kind of already gonna learn bittersweet. So
Mhm.
then I end up just kind of using the super deep Tagalog to my wife's dismay, and it's kind of I've had to go against the current in that regard because not only do I not want my kids missing out on the ability to express a X idea, I also have to deal with my own limited capabilities of remembering and forgetting things. Because if I don't say agre dulce, I'm going to forget it in like a month or so. And so it's kind of just so I it's kind of weird having a family to kind of test it on. With my wife, I'm merciless, but then when I go out to a Filipino gathering, I was at the Independence Day gathering. In the was June. They had it 2 weeks late. The Utah's in Filipino Independence Day Festival, and I kind of have to. I go to Taglish sort of, so
Mhm.
you have to be flexible, I guess. Or at least
Yeah,
I try to be.
you have to understand what words are used. Um, yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult.
Yeah,
And,
it's
being that most of my close Filipino people are not native Tagalog, there are some words that are Tagalog that don't come to me right away. Or when I hear them, I think of something else. Like when I read books, I constantly see dukot for like pull something out. But to me, that's the same as dikit. So like dukot dukot, like to be close to somebody. Or when I see habol, I don't think of chase. I think of blanket because in Bisaya, habol is blanket.
oh,
So like there's just all of these words that they're false friends with Bisaya. And even though I don't speak Bisaya, most of the Filipinos I interact with are Bisaya speakers. So they use this Bislog, and it's definitely exerted an influence on my Tagalog because I'm just used to hearing the Bisaya word thrown into a sentence. I remember when I discovered binti and pa'a versus
mm,
pa'a and til, because
mm,
for Bisayan speakers, pa'a is your leg and til is your foot, whereas in Filipino, binti is your leg and pa'a is your foot. So
mm,
like just weird words where like because the speakers I learned from, you know, um, in an immersion environment were not native, I picked up a lot of these Bisaya-isms, I think. And I've since done away with them, well, mostly. But even to this day, there are some words when I see it, the Bisaya comes to mind before the Tagalog, just because I'm used to it. Um,
Right, and I think it gets easier though. I think it's important to say that with somebody who's like, because I talk with people who are learning Tagalog, and they get sort of like they get depressed a little bit hearing these kind of things, like, you're always learning and stuff, but it gets easier to manage change as you deal with it more and more, because it's it sounds tiring, I'm sure if like somebody was from, if they were getting by in like Spanish or something and they were speaking one way, and then uh w- didn't have to change their Spanish all that often, they might these concepts might sound foreign. But the good news is like people generally want to help you out. They want to your brain kind of gets used to being like, oh, in this village they don't say corbata, they say necktie. They and it, it's not as I just don't wanna scare anybody away from Tagalog. It's you'll get used to it,
Speaking
and
of praise, I have to say, Tagalog web novels are really good. If you like trash fiction, trash fantasy, trash romance, surprisingly good. Uh, so, you know, and it's become so easy to learn Tagalog in 2023. You
yeah,
know, uh, Tagalog.com, their admin, Jake Hossman, has put auto-generated subtitles on a whole bunch of stuff, and before that, he was paying people to license them and have subtitles, and, like, you can do the Refold method with Tagalog, and,
yeah,
um, we've got a YouTube corpus-based frequency list so that you can avoid the pitfalls of only learning formal or archaic words, and, like, it's a totally different ballgame than from when I started. You get
right.
the, Tagalog.com reader, one click, poof, you get the definition. Um, yeah, it's amazing, and Tagalog has 80 million speakers. It's like the size of like it's bigger than Polish. It's
Yeah,
about the size of like German. Like it's not a small language. You
not at
know,
all, no,
there's
no.
tons of speakers, tons of content. Tagalog music and poetry are really good.
They
That's
are.
where they shine. Um, and yeah, there's
It's
definitely
rewarding.
don't want to discourage people. Learn Tagalog. We're just sort of musing
Yeah.
here
Well,
as old
and
heads.
yeah, it's with any language, you can always excavate deeper, is really the thing. Like, you could learn forever, even just English, if you're an English speaker, there's always
Oh,
more
for
to learn
sure.
with it.
I took a
And
vacation like a week ago or 2 weeks ago, and I started reading English fantasy. And all of a sudden, I was running into words like I saw the word avant, Avaunt. I'm like, okay, that's probably cognate to Tagalog abante. And it is cognate, it's French for abante. But in this case, in archaic English, it means to boast.
mm, right,
Um, and it's Avaunt, like avant garde or abante in Tagalog. So you're like, okay, I kind of like had an idea of what the word might mean, but I didn't know it meant to boast. Um,
right.
and Yeah, or one time I had a student when I used to teach English bring me a newspaper and it was about lignite and I said, "What the heck is lignite?" And lignite is a type of low quality coal.
Oh, see, I
Yeah,
don't I
they're
don't know.
they're just words that we don't know even as like educated natives of English, right? So,
Right. It's kind of like, it's kind of crazy because like in with language learning, it's like if you've ever played one of those games where like the leveling system is like you get the first couple of levels like nothing, and then when you get into like the last ones, it's takes as long as like all the others, and it's such the reason why I so for me when I got finished my service, um, I saw a lot of my friends at reunions, and their Tagalog was just disappearing, and it it was just from not using it, right? And it was like, man, I worked so hard to get the results I did get, even though I'm not very talented, especially uh, skilled when it comes to languages. And but the reward of losing, or the reward of learning a language is so neat. You have the key to a new culture, and to do you got all these movies, books, all this, and a people, and it was like, I cannot give this up. And so, um even though there's always more to learn, there's the rewards kind of pour in at as the higher you get too. I love, uh, I love Tagalog's, or the Filipino people's, kind of corny humor. They have, it's like I don't, it's not like you have to pick and choose. Like, I can go turn on The Office and still enjoy it, but then I have all this additional, I can throw on Netflix and see all this, bonus stuff. And so we should never be intimidated to just always keep learning, because it's, you're rewarded too, and it's so much fun to, just continue to dive into it. And although it's a never ending chase, it's also a never ending kind of reward system too. So yeah, never give up. Never give up, even on small languages, or not. Tagalog's not, like you said, it's not a small language, but it's like,
Oh, yeah,
it's,
it wipes out tons of languages in Europe, you're
yeah,
looking at,
like
like,
it,
Norwegian with 5,000,000, Catalan with, like, 6 or 8,000,000. I mean,
yeah, it's
it's
got
it's
the people, it
it's
just needs
hefty.
the prestige, kind of.
It doesn't
Yeah,
have the prestige, and
yeah,
the content is all over the place, but
yeah.
it can be good. I definitely like Tagalog web novels. Um, my biggest complaint is that I feel like the bulk of people who read in Tagalog are women.
Mm,
So I feel like I'm not the target. I read a story called Isla Verde in Tagalog, and it was beautifully written. But I got sick of reading about this fisherman's abs every other paragraph because it was written for women. The
mhm.
Tagalog was really good. I was like, I bet the author's a native, and she was ethnically Tagalog. But it was very clearly fan servicing to 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 girl readers, and I'm not a girl.
Mm.
And, I run into that a lot with Tagalog content, where I feel like a lot of the people who consume, like, teleserie and Wattpad books and stuff are girls. That's probably my biggest complaint is, not a lot of content aimed uh, at at guys is what I feel like. Uh,
Yeah, it's got, its, popular market, but it's always super cool when you find a gem that is not available in, or just originally in Tagalog. Like, Lualhati Bautista, for example, is an author
mm,
that you will hear on,
she
like,
wrote
campus a lot. She
yeah,
wrote
Dekada
Dekada
80 or whatever,
Vicente,
ochenta.
or 70. Um,
Okay, yeah.
and Desparecidos, is another one. She's written these good books, and they haven't been translated in English. I hear they're working on them right now, but um, the fact that there's all these just really good books, and you can't read them in English yet, and even if they do translate them in English, I'm worried they're gonna just miss that. There's just gonna be it's gonna miss that flavor, like that those things that are Filipinoisms that you just can't just transfer over very easily. And so it's super cool to find those hidden gems. And um and it's yeah, it's what was I gonna say there? There was, so it's all over the place, like you said. There is a lot of stuff you won't quite enjoy, but we do that with English too, right? There's just all these
There's just
genres.
so much more of it, I think.
Yeah, yeah, there's just more of it, so it's easy to find the stuff you like in English, but it's more rewarding when you have a language like Tagalog and you're like, "Whoa, this is a really good book."
And
And,
there are
yeah.
some things that Tagalog does very well.
Mhm.
Um, you can look at, like, I don't know, anything sort of like, vocational. Like, if you wanna learn how to repair an electric fan, or if you wanna learn how to sort of jailbreak your rice cooker to fry chicken, or if you wanna watch people living in living out in the mountains or something, do something very traditional, like, there are a couple of, like, tribu, like the Mangyan people, and, like, watch them make a bahag, like a loincloth, like, out of, like, plant fiber and, like, all sorts of cool stuff that you're not gonna get in
Right.
English.
Yeah.
Um, so it definitely has its charm. But yeah, it can be bittersweet, um,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, no, it's certainly it's unique. It's a unique experience, and there is a bigger push recently to try to make it more academic. So you'll see like UP, the University of the Philippines, offers like there's PhD papers published in Tagalog now, and they're kind of if you get into a higher level, it's kind of interesting reading an academic paper in another language. If you do read academic papers, for those who do, because if you do read it in another language, it's kind of interesting to read about something just from a point of view so different than yours. Um, just linguistically and just worldview, and so yeah, there's something for everybody, really. And I do the same thing with French a little bit. That was my first Refold language. It technically is French, and it's really fun to watch a movie that I've already seen, but then I can watch it again in French or Tagalog, and it's almost like, in a way, a brand new movie in a kind of weird way, because they sometimes express things differently, and they have jokes that in English you can't really translate over, and then that's in an addition to, like, all the original movies. So, I don't know, I've loved finding Refold because it's just a bunch of folks like me who are just discovering kinda all this. It's fascinating. Um, but, yeah, sorry, I kinda got all over the place there.
No, it's okay. So we're nearing the end of the hour, and that's okay. We did not, unfortunately, really get into the MTU and what you guys do, but that's okay. There's always another time for that. Um, but
And,
it
well,
was what?
I can say just real quick that the MTC was
Our NTC.
MTC is, there's not a lot of, unique stuff there in a lot of ways. There's a lot of study. There's textbook study, role play. Your teacher will be my even though I had two American, sometimes three American teachers, they would pretend to be Filipinos, and you would use what you learned. And the last thing I would say that really just sums up the MTC experience is there's a lot of pretty much sentence construction. Like if you say, I like running, well, you can say, I like blank in a lot of things. And this is you combine that with role play, for example, and you kind of have a quick route to getting output it out in a way that's kind of quick, because essentially we're studying for like 6 weeks, at least that's how long it was when I was there, and then when you get there you have to speak in that language. So it's kind of just that's all there is to it, is just a lot of
It's
study.
interesting how strong people come out of it after 6 weeks, Um, a lot of people come out at least somewhat conversational, Um, it's just impressive to me. How many hours do you guys do a day in those 6 weeks?
Oh, boy, that's a good question. I'm not fully sure because we spend a lot of time studying, and sometimes it's religious study, sometimes it's language study, and the hours kind of blend together when you throw so many of them. But there is a I would have to say I want to say like 3 at least of just purely language study, but then language sort of gets mixed into it and other things. Because like when we do these role plays, for example, it's partly religious training, part linguistic training. So it's kind of mixed together a little bit. But um yeah, and then when you get out in the field, even though you're always immersed in the language, you still set an hour aside a day for just textbook study or speaking with your companion, trying to figure out, hey, where am I lacking in is and sometimes you learn stuff so uh it's not guarantee that you're going to come out conversational, but there are kind of principles. I uh For the sentence construction thing, I guess the resource I see them talk about it is, like mesoguild.com, if you've ever heard of him. He does that a
Is the
little bit.
Australian guy.
Yeah, yeah, he's the Australian guy. He talks about it a little
He was
bit.
like a missionary in Egypt or something.
Yeah, he wasn't LDS, he's very religious, but he's some kind of he's a Protestant type, I believe, and he does something very similar. Like if you can say one thing, then you don't realize you can actually say 100 things if you plug in the words, kind of.
Right, that sort
And
of pattern drilling, I think is the usual term.
yeah, pattern drilling. I like that. So pattern drilling is a big thing in the MTC, and that's the big summation because it's a lot of that. They'll give you little books and they'll have different sections of the sentence cut out that you can create your own sentence. And I still would recommend that in a lot of ways because if you're getting like mid-level in a language and you're not comfortable with outputting, try pattern what did you call it?
Pattern drills.
Pattern drills. They're not bad.
Yeah, I did them for Spanish. It's like, they tell you something like, "Give me the pen," and then they say
Right.
pencil, and then you say, "Give me the pencil." And obviously in Spanish, these are 2 different genders, lápiz versus, pluma. So you would also have to change the article to the correct thing, but
Right.
yeah, I'm a fan of them. I've butted heads with other Refold people over them.
Yeah.
Where do they have a place or not? And I think the, consensus now is they do have a place, and it's fine to use them to get outputting. Um,
Don't get trapped by them, I guess, is the
don't
big.
get trapped.
Yeah, you
And same
don't.
could be said for input. There's a lot of
Mm,
people out there who they input, they never output, and then they're afraid to. So don't get trapped by the input either. If your
well,
goal is to speak, some people don't have a goal to speak, and that's fine. They just want to read books. But if your goal is to speak, don't get trapped by input.
yeah, if you get trapped, just recognize that you're trapped because I would meet so many people, whether they were Catholic priests or Mormon missionaries, and they would get to some level in target language, and then they mentally would be comfortable, and then they wouldn't improve. And you just have to be kind of aware of it that, oh, I'm talking like a sentence pattern drill. I need to kind of break out of that and do something beyond myself. And so it's yeah, get input, get I just realized throughout this whole thing I've probably been mixing up input and output. But yes, get input, uh copy native speakers, try to always improve because your brain wants to be lazy a lot of times. And you can be lazy. You don't have to kill yourself over it, but it's certainly make sure that you're improving and not getting stuck if you have a goal in mind. Like you said, like if you're trying to sound like a native, you're going to have to keep busy for a while,
Mm.
but yeah, yeah,
And actually, I think that's good parting advice is don't get stuck if you're only doing input, start outputting. If you're only doing grammar drills, start inputting. And yeah, so McKay, thank you so much for coming on.
pleasure.
It's lovely to talk to another Tagalog learner, and sometimes I felt alone for people who've never studied it. They don't know what it's like. The media landscape's different, the struggles are different, and hopefully some of the people in the community and the listeners can relate a little bit more, which
Yeah,
is good.
there's somebody out there studying your niche language. That Refold's such a breath of fresh air. I felt the same way. It's like most people learning Tagalog felt like LDS missionaries, which is it's okay, but uh, there it's something neat to share with everybody. There's each culture has something so rich about it that you know uh, Refold kind of helps find those people who are checking those out, and yeah,
Yeah, I said this in the pre-podcast chat. The Refill Tagalog server has the highest concentration of dedicated and or high-level learners that I've seen over my past like 7 years of speaking Tagalog. You know, um, People who read 30 pages a day every single day, and people who um, hang out all the time in different chat rooms and are quite advanced. And um, yeah, before Refold, it was rare to meet someone who could do more than just say hello and goodbye.
yeah,
Um, so, all right, and I think yeah, hope I might have to see you back, and we might talk again in the future more about the MTC.
yeah. I'll try not to get us too off topic this time, but yeah, it's a pleasure. Anytime I'll be on Discord if anybody needs help with Tagalog, and hopefully in exchange somebody can help me out with my French. It's pretty dire still.
That could be a whole episode talking about how we feel in our main L1 or L2 versus our secondary L2. I know that when you don't understand Tagalog, it makes you a little bit more emotional than when you don't understand a French word. There's a difference in it, and I can definitely relate with Tagalog being my main L2. I
Oh
don't
yeah.
get totally upset if I don't understand something in Spanish. But
Oh yeah.
all right.
It absolutely yeah.
And McKay, thank you for coming on. I'll probably have to have you on in the future. And listeners, thank you guys. Bye. I want to thank you for listening to this episode of the Refold podcast. If you're watching the live premiere, you're in luck. Right as it ends, we have an after party over on the Refold Central Discord server. Come join us by using refold.link/join and chat about the episode. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to hear more, you can find older episodes to listen to on YouTube and Spotify. Let us know what you thought about the video by liking and leaving a comment below. Do you have suggestions for upcoming visitors or requests for particular topics? Please feel free to reach out to me on Discord at GeorgePig #5413 or via email at clayton@refold.la. Thank you all for watching and or listening, and I'll see you next week.